29 years old, and still unmated. In the world of the Mooncrest Pack, that single fact was enough to make a woman invisible. It did not matter how kind she was. It did not matter how hard she worked. It did not matter that she had spent her whole life giving everything she had to people who never once said thank you. Her name was Evelyn Nelson, and on the night this story begins, she was standing at the edge of a ballroom filled with golden light, surrounded by people who shared her blood but had never once made her feel like family. The Mooncrest Pack ballroom glowed. That evening, crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls of light. Long tables were covered in white silk and silver trays. Pack members in their finest clothes moved through the room, laughing, drinking, celebrating another year of peace and strength. Evelyn stood near the wall, dressed in a simple grey gown, watching everyone else shine. Across the room, her younger sister Scarlett laughed, so loudly that several heads turned. Scarlett was 26, beautiful, and never let anyone forget it. She raised her glass toward Evelyn with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "At this point," Scarlett said, her voice carrying easily over the music, "Father should simply appoint Evelyn as the permanent caretaker of the nursery. She is so good with children. Maybe that is all the moon goddess ever intended for her." Laughter rippled through the nearby guests. Evelyn felt her face grow warm. She kept her eyes down, staring at the floor, at the pattern in the marble, anything but the faces around her. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself this every single time. It still hurt. Then Grace, the youngest of the three sisters, stood up from her seat. She was 24, with golden hair pinned in elegant curls, and on her wrist was a bracelet that caught the chandelier light and threw it back in 100 directions. "Oh, Evelyn," Grace said sweetly, walking closer, "I almost forgot. You have not seen my mating gift yet." She held out her wrist. The bracelet was made of silver, set with smooth blue moonstones that seemed to glow from within. Several of the she-wolves nearby gasped softly. "My mate traveled to 3 different territories to find these stones," Grace said, turning her wrist so the light danced across it. "He said nothing less would be good enough for me." She smiled, and there was nothing kind in it. "Though I suppose," she added, tilting her head, "mating gifts are rather unfamiliar to you, Evelyn. I forget sometimes." The laughter that followed was louder this time. Evelyn's hands tightened at her sides. She thought about the years she had spent quietly helping this pack. The Omega children she had bandaged, the elders she had sat with through long nights when they were afraid. The countless small kindnesses that no one in this room had ever noticed, because kindness was not the kind of gift that sparkled under chandeliers. She opened her mouth, not sure what she was going to say, when a deep voice cut through the room. "All my daughters have brought pride to Mooncrest Pack." Alpha Christopher Nelson stood at the head table, glass raised, his broad shoulders squared, his face the same stern mask it always wore. The room quieted to listen to him, the way it always did. "Scarlett has secured an alliance with the Riverbend Warriors," he said. "Grace will soon be wed into the Hartwell bloodline, one of the strongest families in the Western Territories. Both unions will strengthen this pack for generations." He paused. His eyes moved across the room and landed on Evelyn. "Except one," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed like stones dropped into still water. The ballroom went silent. Every eye turned toward Evelyn. She felt heat rush into her face, then drain away just as fast, leaving her cold. 29 years old, still unmated. And now, in front of everyone, her own father had just confirmed what the whole pack already whispered about her. That she was the failure of the family, the daughter the moon goddess had forgotten. Evelyn slowly pushed back her chair. Her legs felt unsteady, but she made herself stand, made herself keep her chin level, even as her vision blurred at the edges. She would not cry, not here, not in front of them. She took one step toward the door, and then the massive doors at the far end of the ballroom burst open. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. A line of warriors entered first, dressed in deep navy uniforms trimmed with silver, their postures perfectly straight, their faces calm and alert in the way that only the most disciplined soldiers could manage. Behind them came a voice, deep and commanding, that filled every corner of the ballroom. His Majesty, Alpha King Jackson Carter. For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the entire ballroom rose as one, a wave of silk and velvet and gasps, every pack member bowing low. Evelyn, still frozen halfway between her chair and the door, found herself standing apart from the bowing crowd, her path to the exit suddenly blocked by the very man the whole kingdom feared and respected above all others. She did not know it yet, but everything in her life was about to change. To understand what this moment meant, you have to go back. Not far, just far enough to understand who Evelyn Nelson really was, behind the humiliation, behind the whispers, behind 29 years of being told she was not enough. Evelyn had grown up in Mooncrest Pack, the eldest of 3 daughters born to Alpha Christopher Nelson and his late wife, Margaret. Margaret had died when Evelyn was only 12, leaving behind 3 girls and a father who buried his grief beneath duty and discipline. From that day on, Evelyn had become something the pack needed, but never celebrated. The steady one. While Scarlet and Grace grew up surrounded by attention, admired for their beauty and their charm. Evelyn quietly stepped into the role their mother had left behind. She learned which Omega families needed extra food during the cold months. She learned how to calm a frightened child during a thunderstorm. She learned how to sit beside an elderly pack member in their final days, holding their hand so they would not be alone. Nobody asked her to do these things. She simply did them because someone had to, and because it felt right. But kindness, in Mooncrest Pack, was not currency. Status was, beauty was, and most of all, a mate was. Every she-wolf in the pack was expected to find her mate by the time she came of age. The bond was sacred, a recognition from the moon goddess herself, marking 2 souls as belonging to each other forever. For most wolves, this happened naturally, sometime in their late teens or early 20s. A scent that suddenly became unforgettable, a pull in the chest that could not be ignored, a voice that felt like coming home. Evelyn had felt that pull once, but we will come back to that. For now, picture Evelyn at 29, moving through the halls of the Nelson estate like a ghost that everyone could see, but no one truly looked at. During pack gatherings, visiting wolves often mistook her for a servant. She wore simple clothes, carried trays, refilled drinks, made sure the Omegas had enough food before the higher-ranking wolves noticed they were hungry. When someone asked who she was, the answer was usually a careless wave of the hand and a quick, "Oh, that is just Evelyn, Christopher's eldest. Just Evelyn." Her father had stopped looking at her with warmth long ago. It was not that he was cruel, not directly. He simply treated her like an obligation he had already accepted, he could not fix. He praised Scarlet's beauty. He praised Grace's charm. When it came to Evelyn, he praised her usefulness, the same way he might praise a well-built fence or a reliable horse. Evelyn manages the household well, he would say, when forced to mention her at all. The pack picked up on his tone the way packs always do. If the Alpha did not value his own daughter, why should anyone else? As the whispers grew, 25 and unmated, 27 and unmated, 29 and unmated. Some called it bad luck. Others, more cruelly, called it a sign, proof that something was wrong with her, that the moon goddess herself had looked at Evelyn Nelson and decided she was not worth matching to anyone. Evelyn heard all of it. She heard it in the lowered voices at gatherings, the sideways glances, the pity disguised as concern. Poor Evelyn. Such a shame, really. She is kind enough, I suppose, but kindness does not keep you warm at night. She had learned over the years to simply keep moving, to keep her hands busy, to smile politely and disappear into the next task before anyone could say something else that would sit heavy in her chest for days. On the morning this story truly begins, Evelyn woke before dawn, as she always did. She dressed quietly, tied back her dark hair, and made her way down to the kitchens, where the staff were already preparing for the day. "Good morning, Miss Evelyn," said Martha, the head cook, not looking up from the bread she was kneading. "Good morning, Martha. Need any help?" Martha smiled the kind of warm, real smile that Evelyn rarely received elsewhere in the estate. "Always, dear. The Hartwell representatives are arriving today to finalize things with Miss Grace. Your father wants everything perfect." Evelyn nodded and rolled up her sleeves. As she worked, kneading dough, stirring pots, carrying trays, she could hear the rest of the household waking. Scarlett's voice calling for her maid, Grace humming a happy tune as she tried on dresses for the Hartwell visit, her father's heavy footsteps moving toward his study. No one called for Evelyn. No one needed her for anything except the work itself. By mid-morning, the estate was full of movement. Servants polished silver. Guards stood straighter at their posts. The Hartwell family's carriage rolled up the long drive, and Grace rushed out to greet them, glowing with excitement. Evelyn watched from a side window as Grace was swept into a warm embrace by her future mother-in-law, as gifts were exchanged, as laughter filled the front courtyard. She felt happy for Grace. Truly, she did. Whatever resentment had grown in Evelyn over the years, she had never let it curdle into bitterness toward her sisters. They were, after all, just living the life that had been handed to them. A life where love and status arrived easily, almost as if by right. It was not their fault that Evelyn's life had gone differently. That evening, as the household prepared for a celebratory dinner with the Hartwells, Evelyn helped set the table, arranged flowers, and made sure the youngest servants, many of them Omega children taken in by the pack after losing their families, were fed before the feast began. One of them, a small girl named Ivy, no older than 7, tugged at Evelyn's sleeve. "Miss Evelyn," Ivy whispered, "will there be a pack ball again soon?" Martha said there might be. Evelyn knelt down to Ivy's level and smiled. "There will be the annual pack ball in just a few weeks. Would you like to come and watch the dancing?" Ivy's eyes lit up. "Could I? I do not see why not," Evelyn said gently. "I will make sure of it. It was such a small thing, a small promise to a small girl, but it was the kind of small thing Evelyn had built her entire life around. Moments where she could make someone else's world a little brighter, even if her own remained dim. She did not know, as she made that promise, that the pack ball she had just spoken of would change everything, not just for her, for the entire kingdom. Every person who seems to have given up on love has, somewhere in their past, a reason. For Evelyn, that reason had a name: Ryan Mitchell. 10 years ago, when Evelyn was 19, Ryan had been a young warrior in the Mooncrest Pack's border guard, strong, steady, and kind in a way that reminded Evelyn of the way she tried to treat others. He noticed her long before she noticed him. He would find small reasons to walk past the kitchens when she was working, would offer to carry heavy baskets, would linger after training sessions just to talk with her for a few extra minutes. At first, Evelyn had been wary. She was the Alpha's daughter, after all, even if she was treated like little more than household staff within her own home. She knew how complicated things could become, but Ryan was patient. He never pushed. He simply kept showing up, kept being steady, kept making her laugh on days when laughter felt impossible. Slowly, carefully, Evelyn let herself fall in love with him. For nearly 2 years, they shared something that felt, to Evelyn, like the first real warmth she had known since her mother died. Stolen moments by the training grounds, long walks along the edge of the pack's territory, where the trees opened up to reveal the stars, quiet conversations about the future, a future where, somehow, things might be different. Everyone around them began to whisper, in a different way than the whispers Evelyn was used to. Hopeful whispers. Many in the pack believed that the moon goddess would soon reveal them as true mates. It seemed obvious to everyone who saw them together. The way Ryan's eyes followed Evelyn across a room, the way Evelyn's shoulders relaxed whenever he was near. But the bond never came. No matter how deeply they cared for each other, no matter how right it felt, the mark of a true mate bond, that undeniable pull, that recognition from the moon goddess, never appeared between them. Evelyn told herself it did not matter. Plenty of wolves built happy lives together without the mate bond. Love, real love, the kind built through years of choosing each other, was its own kind of miracle. Her father did not see it that way. When Christopher Nelson learned of the relationship, his response was immediate and final. "He is a border guard," he said, his voice flat. "He has no status, no family name worth mentioning, and no bond to bind you to him. I will not have my daughter throw away whatever future she has left on a man like that." Evelyn had argued one of the only times in her life she had truly raised her voice to her father. She told him that Ryan made her happy, that happiness should count for something. Christopher had simply looked at her the way he looked at a problem that needed solving. "Happiness," he said, "does not strengthen a pack." Within a month, Ryan was reassigned, not dismissed outright. That would have caused too many questions, but transferred to a distant border outpost, one of the most dangerous and remote postings in Mooncrest's territory. The night before he left, Ryan found Evelyn near the training grounds, in the same spot where they had spent so many evenings together. "I will come back for you," he told her, taking both her hands in his. "I do not care what your father says. Give me time to prove myself, to build something he cannot argue against, and then I will come back." Evelyn had nodded, tears in her eyes, and made him promise to write. He did write. For the first few months, letters arrived regularly, full of small details about his new posting, the wolves he served with, the quiet hope that one day this would all be worth it. Then the letters slowed. Then they stopped. Months later, word reached Mooncrest Pack through official channels. There had been a rogue attack on the border outpost. Several guards had been lost. Ryan Mitchell's name was on the list of those who had disappeared during the chaos. Not confirmed dead, but not found either. Evelyn remembered exactly where she was standing when she heard the news. She remembered the way the floor seemed to tilt beneath her, the way sound seemed to fade for several long seconds. She had waited. For months, then years, some small part of her had held onto the word disappeared instead of dead, had told herself that Ryan was too steady, too strong, to simply vanish, but no further word ever came. Eventually, Evelyn stopped waiting, not because she stopped caring, but because waiting had become its own kind of wound, one that reopened a little more each day. From that point on, something in Evelyn quietly closed. She did not become cold. She could never quite manage that, not with the way she was built, but she stopped expecting love to be part of her story. She stopped imagining a future with someone beside her. She redirected all that warmth, all that care she had once poured into Ryan, into everyone around her instead. The Omega children, the elderly pack members, anyone who needed kindness and had nowhere else to find it. It was, in its own way, a kind of survival. Meanwhile, life moved on for her sisters, the way it always did. Scarlett found her mate at 22, a warrior from the Riverbend Pack, strong and ambitious, with a family name that made Christopher Nelson practically glow with approval. Their bond had been instant, undeniable, celebrated with a ceremony that lasted 3 days. Grace, always eager to follow in her older sister's footsteps, had been matched through careful arrangement with the Hartwell family. Not a true mate bond, but a strategic alliance that her father considered just as valuable. Grace had embraced the match eagerly, drawn as much by the Hartwell family's wealth and status as by her intended's charm. Both sisters, in their own ways, became more confident with each passing year, more certain of their place in the world, and, perhaps inevitably, more dismissive of the sister who had neither a bond nor a match, nor any prospects at all. It was not that Scarlett and Grace were monsters. If you had asked either of them, they likely would have insisted they loved their sister in whatever distant way people love family members they have stopped truly seeing. But cruelty does not always require hatred. Sometimes it only requires comfort. The comfort of believing your own good fortune says something about your worth, and that someone else's hard luck says something about theirs. So the years passed. Evelyn turned 25, then 27, then 29, each birthday accompanied by a little more pity, a little more whispered judgment, a little more of her father's barely concealed disappointment. And every year, the invitations to the annual pack ball arrived, and every year, Evelyn attended. Not because she enjoyed it, but because it was expected, and because somewhere, in some small corner of her heart, she rarely let herself examine. She still hoped that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. This year it finally was. But not in any way Evelyn could have imagined. While Evelyn lived quietly within the walls of Mooncrest Pack, far to the north, in the grand capital that ruled over every territory in the land, a very different kind of life was being lived. Alpha King Jackson Carter ruled over all the packs. Every alpha answered to him, every territory bowed to his authority. He had inherited the crown at a young age, after his father's sudden death, and had spent the years since proving, again and again, that he was more than capable of holding it. He was respected, feared, even, by those who had seen what happened to enemies foolish enough to test Mooncrests. No, Carter's territory. And he was, by every outward measure, exactly what a king should be, strong, decisive, untouchable. He was also, though almost no one would have guessed it, deeply lonely. Years earlier, before the crown had fully settled on his shoulders, Jackson had loved someone. Her name does not matter much to this story. What matters is what she taught him. She had been beautiful, charming, and endlessly attentive, at least, attentive to him. It was only after their relationship had progressed far enough that Jackson discovered the truth. She had been positioning herself for months, working to secure her family's influence within the kingdom through her connection to him. The affection had been real enough on the surface, but underneath it had always been calculation. When Jackson ended things, she had not even pretended to be heartbroken. "Did you really think," she had said, almost amused, "that someone like me would fall for someone like you, crown or not?" The crown was always the point, Jackson. It was not the cruelest betrayal in the world. Compared to the things kings throughout history had survived, it was almost mundane, but it left a mark. From that point on, Jackson approached every relationship, every interaction, really, with a kind of quiet calculation of his own. He assumed, until proven otherwise, that anyone who wanted to be near him wanted something from him. Status, protection, influence, a connection to the crown. He was not wrong, most of the time. His advisors, naturally, had opinions about his romantic life, or lack of one. A king without a Luna was, in their eyes, an unfinished king. They brought him reports of eligible daughters from powerful families across every territory. They arranged introductions, dinners, gatherings, all carefully designed to seem casual while being anything but. Jackson endured these efforts with the patience of a man who had learned, long ago, that some battles were not worth fighting directly. He attended the gatherings, he was polite, he danced when required. And then he returned to his quarters alone, night after night, year after year, while his advisors quietly despaired. "You cannot rule forever without an heir, Your Majesty," his closest advisor, an older wolf named Aaron, told him one evening, not for the first time. "I am aware, Aaron," Jackson replied, not looking up from the reports on his desk. "The Mooncrest Pack Ball is in 3 weeks. Alpha Christopher Nelson has 3 daughters of marrying age. 2 are already matched, but the eldest remains unattached. It might be worth. I will attend the ball because it would be a political insult not to," Jackson said, cutting him off. "Beyond that, Aaron, I make no promises." Aaron sighed but said nothing further. He had learned over the years when to push and when to retreat. Privately, Jackson expected the Mooncrest Pack Ball to be exactly like every other gathering he had attended in recent memory. A grand room full of people performing happiness for his benefit. Daughters paraded in their finest gowns, each one perfectly poised, perfectly charming, each one calculating exactly how close they could get to him without seeming too eager. He expected to stand near the head of the room, exchange polite words with Alpha Nelson, dance with one or two daughters out of obligation, and leave as soon as etiquette allowed. He had no idea, none at all, that within that ballroom was a woman who had spent her entire life being told she was worth nothing. He had no idea that he was about to meet someone who had never once, in all her years, tried to get close to him for any reason at all. Because she did not even know, until the moment the doors opened, that he was coming. 3 weeks passed. Jackson's advisors prepared the travel arrangements, the gifts of goodwill to be presented to the Nelson family, the careful diplomatic language for every possible interaction. Jackson packed for the journey with the same lack of enthusiasm he brought to most social obligations. He told himself this would be one more evening to endure, one more room full of strangers trying to win something from him. He had stopped believing, somewhere along the way, that any room could hold someone who simply was, without wanting anything in return. He was about to be proven wrong. The journey to Mooncrest territory took 2 days. Jackson spent most of it in silence, reviewing reports, half listening to Aaron's updates on the political landscape of the region. "The Nelson family has built a respectable pack," Aaron said, flipping through a folder of notes as their carriage rolled along the forest road. "Strong borders, healthy trade relationships. Alpha Christopher is ambitious, eager to strengthen ties with the crown. He has arranged matches for 2 of his daughters already. Scarlett, the second, mated to a Riverbend warrior. Grace, the youngest, set to marry into the Hartwell line. And the eldest?" Jackson asked, mostly out of habit, his eyes still on the report in his hands. Aaron checked his notes. "Evelyn. 29. No mate, no match. Records say she manages much of the household's daily operations." Jackson made a small sound of acknowledgement and turned the page of his report. The information meant nothing to him. Just another name in a long list of names attached to a family he would meet, exchange pleasantries with, and likely never think of again. He had no way of knowing that this name, Evelyn, would, within days, be the only name he could think of. As the carriage rolled closer to Mooncrest territory, the forest opened up to reveal the estate in the distance. Grand, but smaller than the palaces Jackson was used to. Lanterns were already being lit along the pathways in preparation for the evening's ball. "They have gone to considerable effort," Aaron observed, looking out the window. "They always do," Jackson said, his voice flat. He settled back against the seat and closed his eyes for the remainder of the journey, bracing himself for another evening of performance. His and everyone else's. What he did not brace himself for was kindness. Real kindness. The kind that did not perform for anyone. The kind that existed simply because it always had. He did not know yet that he was about to find it. But within a few hours, in a ballroom full of golden light and ambitious smiles, Alpha King Jackson Carter was going to walk into a room expecting nothing, and walk out of it having found everything. The Mooncrest Pack ballroom had never looked more impressive. Long banners hung from the high ceilings, deep blue and silver, the colors of the Nelson family. Tables were arranged along the walls, covered in white silk, and piled with food prepared over days of work. Musicians tuned their instruments in the corner, ready to fill the room with music, the moment the evening officially began. Guests began arriving in the late afternoon, pack members from Mooncrest itself, along with representatives from neighboring territories, all dressed in their finest. The air buzzed with conversation, with the particular kind of excitement that came from knowing something important might happen tonight, even if no one could quite say what. Word had already spread that the Alpha King himself would be attending. For the unmated daughters of Mooncrest and the surrounding territories, this news had transformed an already significant event into something else entirely. Every young she-wolf who had any claim to status had spent the past 3 weeks preparing. New gowns commissioned, Hair and makeup planned down to the smallest detail, every possible advantage considered and reconsidered. Scarlett and Grace, despite both already being matched, were not immune to the excitement. There was a certain prestige, after all, in simply being noticed by the Alpha King, in being seen dancing with him, even briefly, even as a formality. It was the kind of thing that would be talked about for months. "Do you think he will dance with everyone?" Grace asked, turning in front of the mirror in her room, examining the deep emerald gown she had chosen for the evening. "He cannot possibly dance with everyone," Scarlett replied, adjusting her own gown, a rich burgundy that complemented her dark hair. "But he will dance with some. The trick is making sure he notices you before he has danced with too many others. After the third dance or so, kings get bored." "How do you know that?" Scarlett smiled at her own reflection. "I know things." Down the hall, in a much smaller room, Evelyn was getting ready as well, though with considerably less fuss. She had chosen a simple dress in soft grey, the same colour she wore to most formal occasions. It was well made, modest, and entirely unremarkable. She had learned, over the years, that standing out at gatherings like this only invited more comments, more comparisons, more reminders of everything she was not. Better to simply blend into the background. To be useful. To be, as her father had once said, someone who managed things well. As she finished tying back her hair, there was a soft knock at a door. "Miss Evelyn." "Miss Oz." It was Martha's voice. "The Hartwell representatives need extra hands in the kitchen before service begins. Would you mind?" "Of course not," Evelyn said, already moving toward the door. "I will be right there." This was how Evelyn spent the early part of the evening, not in the ballroom enjoying music, but in the kitchens and hallways behind it, making sure everything ran smoothly. She checked on the food preparations. She made sure the Omega staff had eaten something before the long night of service began. She found little Ivy, dressed in her best, those simple clothes, peeking through a doorway at the ballroom beyond. "Is it time yet?" Ivy whispered. "Almost," Evelyn whispered back, kneeling beside her. "Stay close to Martha, and you will be able to watch from the side once the dancing begins." "I promised. Remember?" Ivy nodded eagerly, practically vibrating with excitement. By the time Evelyn finally made her way into the ballroom itself, the room was already full. The musicians played a lively tune. Couples moved across the floor in practiced steps. Laughter and conversation filled every corner. Evelyn found a quiet spot near the wall, not far from where the youngest staff members were gathered to watch, and allowed herself a small smile as she watched Ivy's face light up at the sight of the dancers. It was, for a moment, almost peaceful. Then she heard her name. "Evelyn, there you are." Scarlett approached, glass in hand, her burgundy gown catching the light beautifully. Beside her, Grace adjusted her bracelet. The same one she had shown off weeks earlier, so that it caught the chandelier light. "We were wondering where you had gotten to," Scarlett said, though her tone suggested she had not been wondering very hard. "Hiding in the kitchens again?" "Someone needed to make sure everything was ready," Evelyn said simply. "Of course," Scarlett said, exchanging a glance with Grace. "Someone always does, don't they? And it is always you," Grace giggled. Evelyn said nothing. She had long ago learned that responding only gave these moments more life than they deserved. Across the room, Alpha Christopher Nelson stood near the head table, deep in conversation with several visiting Alphas, his posture rigid with the particular kind of tension that came from hosting an event this important. Every so often, his eyes swept the room, checking that everything was in order, the food, the music, his daughters. When his gaze landed briefly on Evelyn, standing quietly near the wall in her plain grey dress, something flickered across his face. Not warmth. Something closer to mild irritation, quickly smoothed away as his attention moved on. Evelyn looked away before he could see that she had noticed. The evening continued. More dances, more laughter, more glasses raised in toasts to alliances and futures and the strength of the Mooncrest pack. And then, near the edge of the dance floor. Something happened that Evelyn would think about for a long time afterward, though in the moment, it seemed like such a small thing. A young Omega girl, no older than 5 or 6, had wandered too close to the dancing couples, mesmerized by the swirling gowns and bright lights. She tripped over the hem of her own dress and fell hard onto the marble floor, letting out a startled cry. For a moment, nobody moved. The dancers nearby barely glanced down, stepping carefully around the small obstacle without truly seeing her. A few guests frowned at the interruption, as if the child's cry were simply an inconvenient noise. Evelyn was already moving. She crossed the floor quickly, kneeling beside the girl before anyone else had even fully registered what had happened. Hey, you are all right," Evelyn said softly, gently helping the girl sit up. The child's knee was scraped, a small trickle of blood visible, and her lower lip trembled as tears welled up. "It hurts," the girl whispered. "I know. Let me see." Evelyn carefully examined the scrape. Minor, nothing serious, but it clearly stung. She pulled a small handkerchief from the pocket of her gown. She always carried one. An old habit, from years of tending to scraped knees and runny noses, and gently pressed it against the wound. "There," Evelyn said softly. "That is the worst part over. You were very brave." The girl sniffled, then managed a small, wobbly smile. "Do you want to sit with my friend Ivy for a bit?" Evelyn asked. "She is right over there, and I think she would love some company while she watches the dancing." The girl nodded, and Evelyn gently helped her to her feet, walking her over to where Ivy and the other children were watching from the side. She made sure the girl was settled comfortably, said a few more soft words, and then, satisfied, straightened up to return to her place near the wall. The entire moment had lasted less than 2 minutes. What Evelyn did not know was that someone had been watching every second of it. Alpha King Jackson Carter had arrived only a short while earlier, his entrance marked by the formal announcement, the bowing crowd, the brief exchange of greetings with Alpha Christopher Nelson. He had taken his place near the head of the room, exactly as expected, prepared to endure the evening with the same practiced patience he brought to every gathering like this. He had been watching the room the way he always did, assessing, cataloguing, noting which families positioned their daughters where, which conversations were performed for his benefit, which smiles were real and which were calculated. It was, frankly, exhausting. The same patterns, every time, in every territory. And then he had seen the girl fall. He had watched the dancers step around her without truly seeing her. He had watched several guests frown, as if she were an inconvenience. And he had watched a woman in a simple grey gown move through the crowd without hesitation, kneel down without a moment's thought for her own dress, and tend to the child with a gentleness that asked for nothing in return. There had been no audience for that moment. No one of importance had been watching, or so the woman clearly believed. She had not performed kindness for effect. She had simply been kind because the child needed someone to be. Jackson found himself watching her even after she had returned the girl to safety. He watched her settle quietly back near the wall, near the children, smiling faintly as she watched them watch the dancers. "Aaron," Jackson said quietly, without taking his eyes off her. Aaron, standing nearby, followed his gaze. "Your Majesty? Who is that woman?" Near the wall, in grey with the children. Aaron studied her for a moment, then consulted his memory of the notes he had reviewed. "That would be Evelyn Nelson, Your Majesty. The eldest daughter." Something shifted in Jackson's expression, subtle, but Aaron, who had served him for years, noticed it immediately. "The unmated one," Jackson said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, Your Majesty." Jackson said nothing further, but his eyes did not move away from Evelyn for a long moment. Across the room, oblivious to any of this, Scarlet had positioned herself directly in the Alpha King's line of sight, laughing a little too loudly at something one of the visiting nobles had said, occasionally glancing toward Jackson to gauge whether he had noticed. He had not really. The musicians began a new song, slower, more formal, the kind of dance reserved for important guests. This was the moment every unmated she-wolf in the room had been waiting for. Tradition held that the Alpha King would select a partner for this dance. A significant gesture, one that would be discussed and analyzed for weeks afterward. Scarlet straightened. Grace, nearby, did the same. Across the room, a dozen other young women did similarly, each one trying not to look as though they were trying. Christopher Nelson, sensing the moment, made his way toward Evelyn, not out of any sudden concern for her, but because tradition also dictated that the host's family should be visibly present and accounted for during such moments. He found her near the wall and, in a low voice, said, "Evelyn, stand somewhere more visible. It reflects poorly if you are hiding near the children during a formal dance." It was, in its own way, the most attention he had given her all evening, and it was only because her absence might be noticed. Evelyn, used to such instructions, simply nodded and moved a few steps closer to the dance floor. Though she made no effort to draw attention to herself, she had no expectation of being chosen for anything. She simply did as she was told, the way she always did. And then Scarlet, perhaps emboldened by the wine, perhaps simply unable to resist one more opportunity, turned toward Evelyn with a bright smile that did not match the words that followed. "Evelyn, dear, you really should smile more," Scarlet said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Standing there with that face, anyone would think you were jealous. Though I suppose," she added, glancing meaningfully toward Jackson, "there is nothing to be jealous of. Some women are simply not meant for moments like this." A few quiet laughs followed, not as many as before, but enough. Evelyn felt the familiar heat rise in her face, the familiar urge to simply disappear into the floor. She did not see Jackson's expression change. She did not see the way his jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, at the casual cruelty of the comment. What Evelyn saw, a moment later, was the Alpha King beginning to move. He walked away from the head of the room, away from Aaron, away from the cluster of important alphas he had been speaking with. He walked past Scarlet, who straightened instinctively, a hopeful smile already forming. He walked past Grace, who did the same. He walked past a dozen other, carefully positioned daughters, each one holding their breath as he approached, and then continued past. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath as one. Jackson walked directly toward Evelyn. For a moment, Evelyn genuinely did not understand what was happening. She glanced behind her, certain there must be someone else, some other purpose for the king's approach that simply happened to align with her location. There was no one else. Jackson stopped directly in front of her. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had seemed from across the room. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp green eyes that seemed to look at her with an intensity she did not know how to interpret. He extended his hand. "May I have this dance?" The words echoed through the silent ballroom. Evelyn stared at his hand, then at his face, certain, absolutely certain, that this must be some kind of mistake. Surely he meant to address someone else. Surely, in a moment, an advisor would step forward and gently redirect him toward Scarlet, or Grace, or any of the dozen women who had spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. But Jackson's hand remained extended. His eyes remained on hers, patient, steady. "Your Majesty," Evelyn said softly, her voice barely audible even to herself. "I believe there may be some confusion. My sisters." "I did not ask your sisters," Jackson said, his voice calm but carrying easily in the silence. "I am asking you." Somewhere behind Evelyn, she heard Scarlet's sharp intake of breath. She heard the faint, stunned murmur beginning to ripple through the crowd. Evelyn looked down at Jackson's extended hand once more. 29 years of being overlooked. 29 years of being the daughter no one chose, no one wanted, no one saw. Slowly, hesitantly, as though she were afraid the moment might shatter if she moved too quickly, Evelyn placed her hand in his. Jackson's fingers closed gently around hers. "Thank you," he said quietly enough that only she could hear it, and then, was in front of the entire ballroom, in front of her father, her sisters, and every pack member who had spent years deciding she was worth nothing. Alpha King Jackson Carter led Evelyn Nelson onto the dance floor. The music began. For the first time in longer than Evelyn could remember, the room was not whispering about her failures. It was simply watching in stunned silence as something entirely unexpected unfolded before them. The dance lasted only a few minutes, but for Evelyn, it felt as though time had slowed down entirely. Jackson moved with the easy confidence of someone who had danced at 100 formal events, but there was nothing careless about the way he held her. Steady, respectful, his eyes returning again and again to her face, as though he were trying to memorize something. "You are not enjoying this," Jackson observed quietly, as they moved through the steps. Evelyn blinked, startled. "I am sorry, Your Majesty, I did not mean." "That is not a complaint," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Most people enjoy dancing with me a great deal more than seems natural. It is refreshing to dance with someone who looks like they would rather be anywhere else." Evelyn felt a small, surprised laugh escape before she could stop it. "I apologize. I am simply not used to this. Not used to dancing. Not used to being seen," Evelyn said before she could think better of it. Something in Jackson's expression shifted, not pity, which Evelyn had received plenty of over the years, and had learned to recognize instantly. This was something else, something closer to genuine curiosity. "That seems like a strange thing for anyone to say about you," Jackson said, "given that I just watched an entire ballroom hold its breath the moment I walked toward you." Evelyn's cheeks warmed. "That was about you, Your Majesty, not about me." "I disagree," Jackson said simply, and did not elaborate further. The dance ended a moment later, and Jackson escorted Evelyn off the floor with the same easy formality he had used to lead her onto it. He inclined his head politely. "Thank you for the dance, Lady Evelyn." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Evelyn managed, still slightly dazed. And then he walked away, back toward Aaron and the cluster of alphas, leaving Evelyn standing near the edge of the dance floor as the music resumed and the room slowly, gradually, returned to its normal volume. Though the conversations now buzzed with a very different topic than before, Evelyn did not have long to process what had happened before Scarlet appeared at her side, gripping her arm with fingers that dug in just slightly too hard. "What was that?" Scarlet hissed, her smile fixed in place for the benefit of anyone watching, even as her voice carried an edge Evelyn had rarely heard. "I do not know," Evelyn said honestly. "I have never met him before tonight." "Obviously," Scarlet snapped, "which makes it even stranger that he—" She cut herself off, glancing around at the watching crowd, and forced her smile wider. Never mind. It was probably nothing, a formality. Kings dance with all sorts of people. Evelyn said nothing. She had learned, long ago, that arguing with Scarlet rarely accomplished anything. Across the room, Christopher Nelson had gone very still, watching the exchange with an expression Evelyn could not quite read. Something between confusion and calculation, as though he were trying to determine what this meant, and how it might be useful. For the rest of the evening, Evelyn noticed people looking at her differently. Not with the casual dismissiveness she was used to, but with a kind of curious reassessment, as though they were seeing her for the first time and trying to figure out what they had missed. She found it deeply uncomfortable. She slipped away from the ballroom as soon as she reasonably could, retreating to the quiet of the kitchen, where Martha and the staff were beginning to clean up. "Miss Evelyn!" Martha exclaimed, eyes wide. "Is it true? Did the Alpha King really?" "It was just a dance, Martha," Evelyn said, though her voice wavered slightly. "It does not mean anything." Martha studied her for a long moment, then smiled knowingly, but said nothing more. Evelyn told herself, that night, lying awake in her small room, while the sounds of the ball's final hours drifted faintly through the walls, that it had been a strange but isolated moment. A kindness, perhaps. The king had clearly noticed the way Scarlet spoke to her, and had simply chosen to make a point. That was all it was. A point. A small act of fairness from a powerful man. The kind of thing kings could afford to do on a whim, without it meaning anything at all. She did not expect to ever think about it again, beyond as a strange and slightly embarrassing memory. She was wrong. 3 days later, a royal messenger arrived at the Nelson estate. The household was thrown into a flurry of activity the moment the messenger's colors were spotted on the road. Royal messengers did not simply appear without reason, and an unexpected visit so soon after the pack ball could mean anything from a diplomatic concern to, in the more anxious corners of the staff's imagination, some kind of trouble. Christopher Nelson received the messenger personally, in his study, while the rest of the household waited tensely in the halls. When Christopher emerged, his expression was difficult to read. "The Alpha King," he announced, to the gathered household, "will be passing through Mooncrest territory again next week on his return journey from the eastern border. He has requested." Christopher paused, as though the words themselves were unusual to say aloud. "He has requested to stop here, to rest, and to extend his thanks for the hospitality shown during the pack ball." Scarlett's eyes lit up immediately. "He is coming back?" "Apparently so," Christopher said. "This is wonderful," Grace exclaimed. "We should prepare immediately." "There is more," Christopher said, cutting off her excitement. He glanced toward Evelyn, who stood quietly near the back of the gathered household, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite warmth, but something Evelyn had rarely seen directed at her. "Attention. The message specifically requests that Lady Evelyn be available, should His Majesty wish to continue their conversation from the ball." The room went very quiet. Evelyn felt every eye turned toward her, and for once the attention was not mocking. It was something closer to disbelief. "There." "Conversation?" Scarlett repeated slowly. "That is what the message says," Christopher confirmed. For the first time in longer than Evelyn could remember, her father looked at her. Really looked at her, with an expression that was not disappointment. It would have been a nice feeling if Evelyn had not immediately understood exactly what it meant. Her father was not looking at her with newfound affection. He was looking at her the way he looked at a useful piece of land he had previously overlooked, recalculating its value now that someone else had expressed interest in it. Evelyn excused herself as soon as she reasonably could, retreating to her room, where she sat by the window for a long time, watching the late afternoon light fade over the training grounds where she had once walked with Ryan all those years ago. She did not know what to make of any of this. A dance was one thing, a small, public gesture that could be explained away easily enough. But a deliberate return visit, a specific request for her presence, that was something else entirely. Part of her, the part that had spent years protecting itself from disappointment, immediately began constructing explanations that did not involve hope. Perhaps it was about something political. Perhaps the king simply wanted information about the pack's daily operations, and Evelyn, as the one who managed the household, was simply the most useful source. Perhaps it meant nothing at all, and she was building an entire narrative out of a polite afterthought. But another part of her, smaller, quieter, a part she had not heard from in nearly a decade, whispered something different. What if it was not nothing? She did not let herself finish that thought, not yet. The following week passed in a strange, suspended kind of tension. The household prepared for the king's visit with even more care than they had prepared for the ball itself, though this time the preparations were quieter, more personal. A single important guest rather than an entire ballroom of them. When the day finally arrived, Jackson's arrival was far less grand than his entrance at the ball had been. A modest escort, a simple but elegant carriage, and Jackson himself, dressed less formally than before, stepping down onto the estate's front steps with the easy bearing of someone used to commanding attention without needing to demand it. Christopher Nelson greeted him with the appropriate formality, offering refreshments, a tour of the grounds, anything His Majesty might desire. Thank you, Jackson said politely. But I believe I mentioned in my message that I hope to continue a conversation with Lady Evelyn if she is available. Evelyn, standing slightly behind her father, felt her heart do something strange and unfamiliar. Of course, Christopher said smoothly, stepping aside. Evelyn, perhaps you could show His Majesty the gardens. It was, Evelyn realized with quiet disbelief, the first time her father had ever suggested she do something simply because someone had asked for her, specifically, rather than because the task needed doing, and she happened to be available. She led Jackson through the estate's gardens, a quiet, well-tended space that Evelyn had always found peaceful, away from the noise of the main household. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by bird song and the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet. I imagine, Jackson said eventually, that my visit caused quite a stir. A small one, Evelyn admitted. And the dance 3 days ago, that caused a stir too, I imagine. A larger one, Evelyn said, and Jackson laughed, a genuine surprised sound that seemed to catch even him off guard. I have been told, Jackson said after a moment, that I do not laugh very often. My advisors find it concerning. I find that hard to imagine, Your Majesty. You seem like someone with a great deal to laugh about. A kingdom, a crown, more wealth than most people could imagine. Things, yes, Jackson said, though things do not laugh back. Evelyn glanced at him, surprised by the simple honesty of the statement. It was not the kind of thing she expected a king to say. Certainly not to someone he had met only once, briefly, at a dance neither of them had planned. Why did you ask me to dance? Evelyn asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. At the ball, there were dozens of women who had spent weeks preparing for exactly that moment. I had not. I did not even want to be in that ballroom. Jackson considered the question for a long moment, his eyes on the garden path ahead of them. Before I asked you to dance, he said slowly, I watched a child fall on the dance floor. I watched an entire room of people step around her, as though she were a piece of furniture that had been inconveniently placed, and then I watched you, the only person in that room who seemed to actually see her, cross the floor without a moment's hesitation, kneel down without caring about your dress, and make sure she was all right. He paused. I have attended more gatherings like that than I can count, Lady Evelyn. I have watched hundreds of people perform kindness, perform interest, perform whatever version of themselves they believe will be most useful to me. What I saw you do was not a performance. You did not know anyone important was watching. You did it because the child needed help, and that was enough of a reason. Evelyn did not know what to say. No one had ever described one of her small, ordinary acts of kindness as though it meant something, as though it was worth noticing, worth remembering. And then, Jackson continued, his voice quieter now, I heard the way your sister spoke to you, and I understood very quickly that the room had spent a great deal of time deciding you were worth nothing, and that you had spent a great deal of time believing them. Evelyn's throat tightened unexpectedly. She looked away, toward the garden's edge, blinking hard. I am sorry, Jackson said. I did not mean to upset you. You did not, Evelyn said, her voice thick. It is only that. No one has ever said anything like that to me before. They walked in silence for a while after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Easier, somehow, as though something unspoken had shifted between them. Over the following weeks, Jackson's visits to Mooncrest became more frequent. Sometimes he came under the guise of diplomatic business, meeting briefly with Christopher Nelson before finding his way to the gardens or the quiet study where Evelyn often worked through the household's accounts. Sometimes there was no pretense at all, simply a message ahead of time asking if Evelyn would be available for a walk, or a conversation, or nothing in particular at all. Their conversations ranged everywhere. Books Evelyn had read during the long, quiet evenings of her childhood, the day-to-day realities of managing a large household, something Jackson, who had grown up surrounded by servants who handled everything, found endlessly fascinating. Evelyn's memories of her mother, who had died when Evelyn was 12 and whom Evelyn rarely spoke of to anyone. And, slowly, painfully, carefully, Ryan. Evelyn told Jackson about Ryan one evening, sitting on a bench in the gardens as the sun set behind the trees. She told him about the 2 years they had shared, about the bond that never came, about her father's intervention, about the border posting, the rogue attack, the years of waiting that eventually became years of grief. Jackson listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. "I am sorry," he said when she finished. "That kind of loss does not heal cleanly. I do not think it ever fully does." "You speak as though you understand," Evelyn said. "Not in the same way," Jackson admitted, "but I understand what it is to stop expecting good things from people. To assume, before anything else, that affection comes with a price." He paused. "I have spent a long time assuming that about everyone I meet. And now?" Jackson looked at her, and for a moment, something in his careful, guarded expression softened entirely. "Now," he said quietly, "I am beginning to think I was wrong about at least one person." Evelyn felt something in her chest, something warm and frightening, and entirely unfamiliar after so many years of carefully not feeling anything at all. For the first time since Ryan, Evelyn found herself laughing freely. Not the polite, careful laughter she offered at family gatherings, but real laughter, the kind that came easily, unguarded, surprising even herself sometimes with how natural it felt. And Jackson, the alpha king who had not laughed in years, who approached every relationship with calculated distance, found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, simply at peace. Not everyone in Mooncrest Pack was happy about this development. As Jackson's visits continued, and as word of his evident interest in Evelyn spread, first as rumor, then as something closer to common knowledge, the whispers that had once mocked Evelyn for being unmated began to shift into something sharper. Scarlett, in particular, found the situation increasingly difficult to accept. The sister she had spent years dismissing, the sister everyone had agreed was simply unworthy of attention, was now receiving more of it than Scarlett ever had. "It does not make sense," Scarlett said to Grace one afternoon, the two of them sitting in Scarlett's room, while Evelyn was, predictably, occupied elsewhere in the household. "He is the Alpha King. He could have anyone. Why would he choose someone like Evelyn?" "Maybe it is pity," Grace suggested. "Kings do strange things sometimes, do they not? Maybe he simply felt sorry for her, after the way things were said at the ball." "Pity," Scarlett repeated slowly, something calculating entering her expression. "Yes, that would make sense, would it not? It is the only explanation that does make sense." The idea took root quickly, the way ideas do when they offer a comfortable explanation for something uncomfortable. By the time evening fell, Scarlett and Grace had thoroughly convinced themselves, and had begun, carefully and quietly, to share their theory with anyone who would listen. It was only pity, they said. The king felt sorry for poor Evelyn after the embarrassment at the ball. He was simply being kind, in the way powerful people sometimes were toward those less fortunate. It would not last. It could not last. Surely he would come to his senses soon enough, once the novelty wore off, and if it did not end on its own, well, perhaps it could be helped along. Evelyn, absorbed in the quiet happiness of her growing friendship with Jackson, remained largely unaware of the conversations happening behind closed doors throughout the estate. She did not know that the cruelty she had endured for years, cruelty she had learned to simply absorb and move past, was about to take a sharper, more deliberate turn. And she had no idea that the man who had spent years protecting his heart from exactly this kind of manipulation was about to overhear something that would change everything. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of afternoon that, until that moment, had felt unremarkable. Jackson had arrived at the Nelson estate a little earlier than expected, his visit not yet formally announced to the household. He had grown comfortable enough with Mooncrest and with Evelyn that he sometimes arrived quietly, without the usual formal procession, simply walking through the gardens or the halls until he found her. On this particular afternoon, he had been told that Evelyn was likely in the east sitting room, where she often worked through the household accounts in the quiet hours after midday. He made his way there alone, his footsteps soft against the polished floors. As he approached the sitting room, he heard voices through the partially open door. Scarlett's voice and Grace's, raised slightly, the way voices rise when people believe themselves to be unheard. He should have announced himself. He knew that, even in the moment, but something in the tone of the conversation made him pause. Honestly, I do not understand why she has not figured it out yet, Scarlett was saying, her voice carrying easily through the door. It is so obvious. The Alpha King felt sorry for her. That is all this is. He saw how we treat her, how Father treats her, and he decided to play the kind, generous king for a while. It probably makes him feel good about himself. Do you think he actually likes spending time with her? Grace asked, sounding genuinely curious. Likes? Scarlett laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Grace, look at her. She is 29, unmated, with nothing to offer anyone. She has spent her whole life being useful to other people, because that is the only thing she has ever had to give. Of course, the king does not actually like her. He is humoring her. Being kind to the sad, lonely sister is the kind of thing kings do when they want to feel important. It does seem strange that it has gone on this long, though, Grace said. It will not go on much longer, Scarlett said confidently. These things never do. Once he realizes she has nothing real to offer, no status, no real charm, nothing beyond a sad story he can feel good about pitying, he will move on. And honestly, the kindest thing would be for someone to make sure Evelyn understands that before she embarrasses herself further. She is already letting herself believe this means something. It would be cruel to let that continue. Cruel to let her believe it, Grace repeated slowly. But you are not planning to actually say anything to her, are you? Of course not directly, Scarlett said. That would be unkind. But there are ways to make sure she understands her place. She has spent her whole life understanding her place, after all. It should not be difficult to remind her. Jackson stood very still in the hallway, his hand resting against the doorframe, every word landing with a weight that surprised even him. He had heard cruelty before. He had heard manipulation, calculation, ambition disguised as concern. He had heard all of it many times from many people throughout his entire life as a king, but something about hearing it directed at Evelyn, at the woman who had, slowly and without either of them quite realizing it, become the person he most looked forward to seeing, settled into his chest like a stone. He pushed the door open. Scarlett and Grace both turned, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace's face went pale immediately. Scarlett, to her credit, recovered more quickly, though her smile, when it appeared, was strained. Your Majesty, Scarlett said, dropping into a quick curtsy. We did not realize you had arrived. We were just. I heard, Jackson said simply. The room went very quiet. I heard everything, Jackson continued, his voice calm, calmer, in some ways, than either of them had expected, which somehow made it worse. And I think it is important that you both understand something, since you seem to have spent a great deal of time discussing my motivations without ever once considering that I might simply tell you, if asked. Neither Scarlett nor Grace said anything. You are correct, Jackson said, that I noticed how this household treats your sister. I noticed it within minutes of arriving at the pack ball. I noticed the way she was spoken to, the way she was dismissed, the casual cruelty that everyone in this household seems to consider perfectly normal. He paused. What you are wrong about, he continued, is what that noticing led to. I did not ask Evelyn to dance us out of pity. I asked her because, in a room full of people performing kindness for my benefit, she was the only person who showed real kindness without any audience at all. And in the weeks since, I have come to know someone who is, without question, the most genuinely good person I have ever met." His voice did not rise, but something in it sharpened. "Evelyn possesses more strength, more dignity, and more kindness than anyone I have encountered in this pack. Including, I am sorry to say, either of you. She has spent years absorbing exactly the kind of cruelty you were just discussing. And she has done so without ever once becoming cruel in return. That is not weakness. That is something most people, myself included, struggle to manage even once, let alone for years." Scarlett's face had gone through several colors during this speech, settling finally on something pale and stricken. Grace looked, if anything, even worse, tears welling in her eyes, though whether from shame or simple shock, it was difficult to say. "I think," Jackson said, "that this conversation is over." He turned and left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. He did not go looking for Evelyn immediately. He needed a moment to settle the anger that had risen in him, sharper and more immediate than anything he had felt in years, and to think about what he had just heard and what it meant. He found her eventually in the gardens, sitting on the bench where they had first talked about Ryan, a book open on her lap that she did not appear to be reading. She looked up as he approached, and something in his expression must have shown, because her smile faded into concern. "Jackson? Is something wrong?" He sat down beside her, close enough that their hands nearly touched, and was quiet for a moment before speaking. "I overheard your sisters earlier," he said, "talking about why I have been spending time with you." Evelyn's expression shifted. Not surprise, exactly, but something resigned, something that suggested this was not the first time she had braced herself for this particular conversation, even if it had never happened quite like this before. "What did they say?" she asked quietly. "That I felt sorry for you," Jackson said. "That this, whatever this is between us, is nothing more than a king amusing himself by being kind to someone he pities. That it would not last, and that someone should make sure you understood that before you, in their words, embarrassed yourself further." Evelyn looked down at the book in her lap, her fingers tightening slightly around its edges. "They are not entirely wrong to wonder," she said quietly, after a moment. "I have wondered it myself. I am 29, Jackson. I have no status, no bond, nothing that would make sense of someone like you choosing to spend time with someone like me. I have spent most of my life being told, in one way or another, that I am not worth very much. It would be strange if some part of me did not, occasionally, wonder if they were right about this too. Evelyn, I am not saying I believe them," Evelyn continued, her voice steadier now, though something in it had grown thin, fragile. "I am saying that no one, not my father, not my sisters, not anyone in this pack, has ever, not once, stood up for me. Not really. I learned a long time ago that the only person I could count on to defend me was myself, and most of the time, even I did not bother, because it never seemed to change anything." She looked up at him, and for the first time since he had known her, Evelyn's careful composure cracked entirely, her eyes filled with tears she did not try to hide. "No one has ever defended me before," she said, her voice breaking on the words, "not once, in 29 years. The word struck Jackson with a force he had not expected. He had grown up surrounded by people who fought constantly for status, for advantage, for the king's attention, an entire world of people who would defend themselves, loudly and often, over the smallest perceived slight. And here was someone who had endured a lifetime of genuine cruelty without a single person. Not even, it seemed, herself, stepping forward to say that she deserved better. Jackson reached over and gently took her hand. "You have someone now," he said quietly. "I do not know what this is, Evelyn, what we are, what this has become. But I know that I am not going anywhere, and I know that I am not going to stand by and let anyone in this pack speak to you, or about you, the way they have for years. Pity is not what brought me to that ballroom floor, and it is not what has brought me back here, again and again, for weeks." He paused, his thumb moving gently over the back of her hand. "I do not know exactly what this feeling is," he said more quietly still. "I have spent so long assuming that anything resembling affection came with conditions, with calculations, with some hidden price. I do not know how to recognize something real, because I have spent years convincing myself real did not exist." He looked at her, and his voice, when he continued, was barely above a whisper. "But I think this might be it. I think this might be what it is supposed to feel like." Evelyn, tears still on her cheeks, let out a small surprised laugh, somewhere between disbelief and overwhelming relief. "That is a very roundabout way," she said softly, "of saying something, Your Majesty." Jackson smiled, a real smile, the kind Evelyn had come to recognize as rare and precious. "I am told," he said, "that I am better at decisive action than I am at words." "I noticed," Evelyn said. "The dance was certainly more direct." "Would it help?" Jackson asked. "If I were direct again?" Evelyn's heart, which had spent 29 years carefully guarding itself against exactly this kind of moment, suddenly felt as though it might not survive whatever was coming. "I think," she managed, "that it might." Jackson leaned closer, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. What happened next would, within hours, become the second piece of news to sweep through the Nelson household. Though this time, unlike the dance, there were no witnesses beyond the quiet garden and the late afternoon light. But word travels quickly in households where everyone is paying close attention. And by that evening it was clear to everyone. Christopher Nelson, Scarlett, Grace, every servant and pack member who had spent years deciding Evelyn was worth nothing. That whatever this was between Evelyn and the Alpha King, it was not going away, and it was not, as Scarlett had so confidently predicted, pity. Word of what had happened spread through Mooncrest within days, and from Mooncrest it spread further, to neighboring territories, to the capital, to every corner of the kingdom, where people paid attention to the affairs of the crown. The Alpha King, who had spent years resisting every effort to find him, a Luna, who had turned away daughter after daughter from family after family, had apparently found someone. And not, as everyone had assumed he eventually would, among the powerful families who had spent years positioning themselves for exactly this outcome. He had found her in Mooncrest, the eldest Nelson daughter, the one nobody had ever considered. The news caused no small amount of confusion among the kingdom's most powerful families, confusion that, in some cases, curdled into something closer to outrage. Surely, many said, this was some kind of mistake, or a temporary infatuation that would pass. Surely the Alpha King would come to his senses and choose someone more suitable. Someone with status, with the right family name, with a kind of bond or connections that made sense for a Luna. 3 weeks after the conversation in the garden, an announcement arrived from the capital. The Alpha King would be hosting the Royal Moon celebration, an event held only on rare occasions when the Crown wished to make a formal announcement of particular significance. Every Alpha family in the kingdom was invited. Attendance was, in practice, mandatory. Speculation about the nature of the announcement ran wild. Some believed Jackson intended to formally announce Evelyn as his choice for Luna, a possibility that filled some with curiosity and others with quiet determination to prevent it, or at least to be present when the inevitable disappointment occurred. Because surely, many still believed, when faced with an entire ballroom of the kingdom's most eligible and impressive daughters, the Alpha King would reconsider. Surely the strange infatuation with the Nelson girl would not survive contact with real options. Scarlett and Grace, despite the deep discomfort of the past few weeks, found themselves swept up in this hopeful narrative, along with everyone else. If the king reconsidered, if he chose someone else, anyone else, at this grand celebration, then perhaps things could return to normal. Perhaps the strange, uncomfortable shift in their household, where Evelyn was suddenly someone people paid attention to, would simply fade away. They arrived at the Royal Moon celebration, with this hope quietly tucked away, though neither of them said it aloud. The celebration was held in the grand hall of the capital, a space so large that the Mooncrest ballroom, which had seemed so impressive only weeks earlier, would have fit inside it several times over. Every alpha family in the kingdom was present, dressed in their finest, the air thick with anticipation and quiet calculation. Evelyn arrived with her father's household, dressed, at Jackson's gentle insistence, conveyed through a quiet note delivered the day before. Not in the simple grey she usually favoured, but in a deep blue gown that Martha had helped her choose, simple but elegant, the colour of the night sky just before the stars appeared. She felt, walking into the grand hall, more nervous than she had ever felt in her life. The space was overwhelming. The scale of it, the sheer number of powerful, important people, all of whom seemed to be watching her with open curiosity as word spread of who she was. "You look beautiful," Martha had told her before she left. "Whatever happens tonight, do not forget that." Evelyn held on to those words as she made her way through the crowd, finding a quiet spot near the edge of the hall, much as she had at the Mooncrest Ball weeks earlier. The hall buzzed with conversation. Beautiful women in elaborate gowns moved through the crowd, each one carefully positioned. Each one hoping that tonight somehow, the strange infatuation with the Nelson girl saw would be revealed as nothing more than a passing whim. Then the great doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the room fell silent. Jackson entered, dressed in formal royal attire, his presence commanding the same immediate, absolute attention it always did. He paused at the entrance, his eyes sweeping across the crowded hall. Several of the most beautiful, most carefully positioned women in the kingdom straightened, smiled, prepared themselves for the moment they had been waiting for. Jackson's eyes moved past them. He walked into the hall, and the crowd parted before him, and for a moment, it seemed as though he was simply making his way toward the head of the room, where tradition dictated the king would stand to make any formal announcement. Then he changed direction. He walked past the cluster of beautiful, hopeful daughters. He walked past Scarlet, who had positioned herself prominently near the front, certain that this, surely, must be the moment things returned to normal. He walked past Grace, whose hopeful expression slowly faded as she realized he was not stopping. He walked directly toward Evelyn, standing quietly near the edge of the hall in her deep blue gown. The hall held its breath, just as the Mooncrest ballroom had weeks earlier, though this time the silence carried a different weight. This was not a single dance, a momentary gesture that could be explained away. This was the royal moon celebration. This was the moment the entire kingdom had gathered to witness. Jackson stopped in front of Evelyn, and then, in front of every alpha family in the kingdom, in front of her father, her sisters, and hundreds of people who had spent weeks insisting that this could not possibly be real, Alpha King Jackson Carter knelt. The sound that went through the hall was not quite a gasp, and not quite a murmur. Something in between, a collective intake breath, from hundreds of people simultaneously realizing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for generations. "Evelyn Nelson," Jackson said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. Status, power, influence. I stopped believing, a long time ago, that anyone could simply want to know me. Not the crown, not the kingdom, just me." He looked up at her, and despite the hundreds of eyes watching, despite the weight of the entire kingdom's attention, his expression held nothing but quiet certainty. "You never wanted anything from me," he continued. "You did not know who I was when I first saw you kneeling beside a child who had fallen, with no audience, no advantage to be gained. Everything I have learned about you since then has only confirmed what I saw that night. Among everyone I have ever met, every powerful family, every carefully arranged introduction, every person who has ever stood in a room hoping to catch my attention, you are the only one who has shown me what real kindness looks like. what real strength looks like, what love is actually supposed to feel like. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, her hand pressed against her chest, as though she could somehow steady the overwhelming feeling rising there. "I am asking you," Jackson said, in front of everyone, "because you deserve to never again wonder whether you are wanted, whether you are seen, whether you are enough. You are more than enough, Evelyn. You always have been. Everyone in this kingdom simply needed time to catch up to what I already knew." He reached into his coat and produced a simple ring, not elaborate, not covered in jewels, but elegant in its simplicity, the kind of thing chosen with care, rather than ostentation. "Will you be my Luna?" Jackson asked. "Not because the kingdom needs one, not for status, or alliance, or anything this crown could offer. Because I love you, Evelyn Nelson. Because I have never, in my entire life, felt the way I feel when I am with you. And because I do not want to spend another day without you beside me." For a long moment, Evelyn could not speak at all. 29 years of being overlooked, of being told she was not enough, of quietly accepting that love was simply not part of the story written for her. All of it seemed to rise up at once, tangled together with the overwhelming reality of the moment, the man kneeling before her, the kingdom watching in silence. "Yes," Evelyn said, her voice breaking, tears spilling freely down her cheeks now. "Yes, Jackson, yes." The hall erupted. The sound that followed was unlike anything the grand hall had heard in years. Applause, cheering, the kind of spontaneous, overwhelming reaction that no formal celebration could have planned for. Jackson rose, slipping the ring onto Evelyn's trembling hand, and then, in front of everyone, pulled her into an embrace that lasted long enough for the cheering to grow even louder. Near the front of the hall, Scarlett and Grace stood frozen, the noise around them seeming to come from very far away. This was not what they had expected. This was not the moment things returned to normal. This was the opposite. The moment everything permanently and irreversibly changed. The sister they had spent years dismissing. The sister they had mocked at the very ball where this all began. The sister everyone had agreed was simply not worth very much. Was, as of this moment, the future Luna of every pack in the kingdom, their future queen. Christopher Nelson, standing nearby, wore an expression that Evelyn, even through her tears, could read clearly for the first time in years. It was not pride exactly, not yet. It was something closer to the dawning realization of just how badly he had misjudged something, and how publicly that misjudgment had just been corrected. Years passed. Evelyn Nelson became Luna Evelyn Carter, and within a short time, she became something the kingdom had not seen in generations, a Luna genuinely beloved by everyone she encountered, not because of her position, but because she carried herself, even as queen, exactly as she always had. She visited the Omega communities in every territory, making sure no child went without enough food during the cold months, exactly as she once had in Mooncrest. She sat with elderly pack members, listened to their stories, made sure they were never alone. She remembered names, not just of nobles and alphas, but of servants, of children, of the quiet people who usually went unnoticed. The kingdom did not love her because she wore a crown. They loved her because she had never stopped being the person she was before anyone knew her name. As for Scarlett and Grace, their lives, on the surface, remained much as they had been. Scarlett's marriage to the Riverbend warrior continued, though over the years, certain things became harder to ignore, ambitions and priorities that had always existed, but had once been easy to overlook, now standing in sharper relief. Grace's match with the Hartwell family proved, in time, to be built on foundations less solid than either family had hoped. The alliance valued more than the marriage itself. Neither sister's life became a disaster, but neither did it become the gleaming, enviable future they had once assumed was simply owed to them. The future they had once been so certain Evelyn, of all people, would never have. Some years later, Scarlett and Grace traveled to the capital, not for a grand occasion, but quietly, almost hesitantly, requesting an audience with the Luna. They came, in the end, not to ask for anything, but simply to say what neither of them had ever managed to say before. They were sorry. Evelyn, who had spent a lifetime absorbing cruelty without letting it harden her, listened to her sisters with the same quiet patience she had always carried. She did not pretend the years of mockery had not hurt. She did not pretend it would be simple to move past entirely, but she also did not turn them away. "We are still sisters," Evelyn told them gently. "That has not changed, even if everything else has. I do not need an apology to know that. But I am glad you came." It was not, perhaps, the kind of dramatic reconciliation some might have expected. There were no grand declarations, no tearful embraces witnessed by crowds. Just a quiet conversation, and the slow, careful beginning of something neither sister had ever truly given Evelyn before: genuine respect. Jackson, watching from a distance as Evelyn spoke gently with the sisters who had spent years tearing her down, found himself thinking, as he often did, about that night at the Mooncrest ball. The laughter, the cruelty, the moment a woman in a simple grey gown had knelt to help a child with no audience at all. He thought about how close he had come to simply enduring that evening, the way he had endured so many others. How easily he might have stood at the head of the room, danced his obligatory dance with someone else, and left without ever truly seeing her. And he thought, as he watched Evelyn now, Luna of every pack in the kingdom, kind to everyone she met, beloved not because of a crown, but because of who she had always been. About something simple, something that had taken him far too long to understand. True worth, he had learned, was never determined by status, or beauty, or age, or whether the moon goddess chose to mark two people as mates. It was determined by the kind of person you were when no one was watching, and the right person, when they finally came along, would see that, would see all of it. The years of being overlooked, the quiet kindnesses no one noticed, the strength it took to remain gentle in a world that had given her so little reason to be. Evelyn Nelson had spent 29 years being told she was not enough. It had taken only one person, the right person, to see that she always had been. And from that night at the pack ball onward, she never had to wonder again.